Hi, everybody that just walked in. I was led to believe that you were sent this link or something like it previously to coming, but if you registered late or for some reason you didn't get an email that had this link in it, please make sure to go to this link tree. It looks like this. It's just the resources that we're going to be using today on top of Godot, obviously, like a working example or a working version of Godot. So just make sure to download these things if you haven't downloaded them yet. And I'll walk through when we're going to be strategically using these things. So just make sure that you have these on deck. Cool? Yes, absolutely. Oh, yes. Great question. Yes, use the GodotCon branch. That's more up to date than main, which is not good practice, but whatever. Yes, great question. Use the GodotCon branch. There's not much differences between them. I just started an empty project, basically, that we'll be using just for kind of convenience sake. Okay. I think I'm gonna get started. Is that cool? Cool with you? Okay. Is that cool with everybody? Is everybody like feel cozy and primed? Great. Some shrugs, yes. Okay, that's fine. Shrugs is appropriate. Hi, welcome. Here we are. This is narrative design for the solo developer or solo dev. I'm Nicholas O'Brien. I'm going to be leading this workshop today. We are going to be joined also by our trusty assistant, Rob, who's sitting up here. If for some reason you're having some difficulty with some of the technical aspects of this project over the course of this little workshop that we're going to be doing, you can kind of raise your hand and Rob will kind of float around and try to help you as best as he can. If for some reason you're still getting stuck, we can take a moment and pause and make sure that we get you up to speed. Cool? If you didn't get that link that I just had on screen, I'm going to show it one more time, so don't worry about it. But it'll come back up again. So I'm Nicholas O'Brien. Hi. How's it been going so far today?
Have fun.
Good? Okay, cool. Great. I'm super excited to be here. Thank you so much, GodotCon, for inviting me. It's really exciting to be at the first Godot conference in the States. Woo! Can I get a whoop? No. Yeah, hell yeah. Okay, so it's super great to be here. Thank you all for being here. Yes, totally. Thank you all for being here. I just saw the list of attendees and I got a little bit intimidated, but I promise we're gonna be like super cool. Okay, so here we go. So I'm Nicholas O'Brien. This is my About Me slide. I'm a developer and designer that working in Godot. I run a small solo studio based in Brooklyn that's called SA Games. We make nuanced, introspective, story-based games about a variety of different topics that are pulled from research or personal experience. We recently published a game in March that's called Bundle of Joy that's about becoming a parent during the pandemic. It plays like a WarioWare-style game with some narrative vignettes in it. It's goofy, lighthearted, and very sincere, and based on my own personal experience. This is a crying baby from that game. This is one of the mini games from that game where you have to plunge the baby's nose. And this is my little work area where I was actively working on this presentation for today. Cool. One other thing, like, you might be thinking, like, who's this guy? I also do some other stuff besides that. I'm also an educator. I teach at the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn. That's where I'm based. That's where my studio is based. And I also put together this Godot and Ink series of tutorials. Some of it is a little bit dated, so you're getting the hot freshness today. But this tutorial has been officially part of the documentation for InkGD, which is the plugin that uses the tools that we will be using together. So I kind of know a little bit about like this stuff, and I think the person that designed the tools trusts me enough to include my knowledge base in their documentation. So please just take that as validation that like, yeah, I'm okay at doing this stuff. Cool. So, but besides that, yeah, I've been working in Godot for I think about 6 years. I kind of predated maybe the more recent wave of people coming from different game engines. After using those other game engines and crying, and so then I stopped using those game engines and stopped crying, and I started working in Godot. And it's been no crying since then, I promise. Just kidding, there's been some crying. But anyways, it's been a really great process, and I really am a huge like champion of Godot, especially for people that are making small personal games, and especially for solo developers. So a little bit other kind of caveat that I want to maybe include as part of this workshop and this kind of tutorial, whatever, is that people that I think are using this tool come from a lot of different backgrounds, and my background is from a fine art background. So I'm not a programmer, and I'm not like a trained computer scientist, and I'm not a person that thinks of themselves as being like a very technical person, even though I make a technical narrative design tool, and that's like my profession. So I'm really coming at this from like working with this tool and with this resource from like a like hardcore technical perspective, right? So I'm really thinking about being an artist and a storyteller first when we're using these tools and making games that reflect that kind of perspective. Cool. So things that you'll need, I promised you that the link would be back up here. This is where I fulfill on that promise. So the things that you'll need for this workshop today are going to be Godot 4.4. If you don't have like 4.4, basically 4.0 plus is going to be cool for us today. The Ink GD plugin for 4.0 up. You'll see on the Ink GD, I think I've directly linked to it in the link tree, so you shouldn't have problems finding it. The templates, the template files, we're going to be working on some community-based template files for that, which is great. Those are also linked in that link tree. Inky, which is a narrative design tool, I'll be talking about that, developed by the Inkle Studio, or the studio that's called Inkle Studios. They made things like 80 Days, Overboard, Expelled, which is a recent game that they made, Heaven's Vault. Kind of well known within narrative design communities and circuits as being kind of a good one. You might want some pen and paper also to take some notes or jot down ideas. And then also like a very basic understanding of GD scripts. We'll be working in GD script. We won't be working in C# for this tutorial. And again, like I said, we're going to be building off of some templates, and we'll be doing some like in-code examples as well. But I'm really going to try to go through that bit by bit, and we'll make sure that we don't leave anybody too much in the dust. Cool? Okay. So what we're going to be actually covering, right, in this workshop over the course of the next 2-ish hours. We're going to be covering some narrative design concepts, so ideas for you to integrate into your own projects, into your own games. We're going to be creating stories, interactive and branching stories using the Inky toolkit, or the Ink programming language. And then we'll be doing an kind of in-engine coding example demo where we're going to glue these things together. Cool. We're going to use the stories that we're making in Ink. We're going to bring them into Godot and have those interactive branching things work within the engine. Cool? Sounds good? Great. If at any point during this workshop or conversation, if you have a very pertinent question that you'd like to ask to the whole group, by all means, raise your hand, and I'm more than happy to pause at any point. If you're experiencing, again, something like, yeah, I'm getting this weird compiler error, like make sure that you raise your hand and maybe just like point to Rob over here, and he'll come over and try to help you. But yeah, I want this to be kind of an open forum, so if you have input or feedback or things that you want to just ask really quickly, feel free to chime in whenever you feel like it. Cool? Okay, so narrative design. Oh, so scary. No, just kidding. Okay, so I went forward. Just kidding. So when we say narrative design, right? That's like in the title of this workshop. Without pulling the things that I might have accidentally just showed you in that next slide, what do we think about when we think about narrative design? What are the concepts or the things that we think about? Yeah. Lore. Cool.
So when you throw the design word in there, I stop thinking about a linear story and I assume a branching and that there's some kind of complexity to it.
Branching narrative. And I would say like maybe systems-based branching narrative. Cool. Any other? Yeah.
What kind of the big what's going on in the game?
Yeah, I would say
Where am I? What am I doing? Oh my God, I'm here.
story. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you. Absolutely. What's going on? Who am I? Who's the character? Who are the NPCs? What's my relationship to them? Absolutely.
That could all be random. You probably don't want it to be like just a random selection thing.
I would say you like never really want it to be random, because that sounds crazy. That to me, that sounds a little, yeah. Unless you're making Caves of Cud, because then that randomness is really cool. Okay. Anyways, yes.
Yeah, tying gameplay mechanics into the story.
Yes. So marrying mechanics, right, with story, right? Absolutely. Having those things overlap and influence one another. Absolutely. Managing complexity, right? In terms of how, elaborate a little bit more.
So when designing a game that has branching in it of any sense, it's very easy to branch yourself into a corner, right? And finding dead ends in your game and preventing dead ends.
Absolutely, right? So finding ways to loop back into the central kind of narrative arc. Absolutely. We're going to be looking at a specific technique to hopefully mitigate or prevent that. Absolutely. Great, cool. Okay, yes.
You already kind of said it, but I was adding on to that, like not just corners, but like you branch for a few levels and things explode into way more complexity than you want.
Right.
You want to be able to rein it back in at certain points at least.
Absolutely, right? So the design part of that, as you were saying before, right, is making sure that you're managing not only expectations for the player, but you're also managing your team, right? You're not creating thousands upon thousands of branching forks, right? You're creating something manageable, something digestible, something, you know, that you can actually get through, right? So that's also part of that design process, right? Cool, thank you all so much for those contributions. So yeah, when we're thinking about narrative design, I think we hit almost everything that's up here. But we talk about the story, we talk about this idea of, I want to get back to the second thing. We talk about quest design, right? That's definitely in narrative design, right? Go here, do the thing, fetch something, get something mechanical in the world, you know, beat up some monsters, collect an item, bring it back here, so on and so forth. That's definitely within narrative design. NPC dialogue, any dialogue, whether it's playable character dialogue or non-playable character dialogue, world building and lore, right? Item location and description, that's 100%, right? Narrative design. How the things that you are collecting in the world are telling you things about that world, right? You collect something and it has a proper noun and you're like, oh, damn. That must be cool, right? It's called the Monster Slayer, right? Or whatever, right? You're like, oh, somebody thought about naming it that. That must mean it's really cool. That's like narrative design, right? That's like part of the process. I want to come, oh, yeah, Rob.
Maybe this is a question about what isn't narrative design, but would you consider if you have, say you have like an action game, you're going through a level and you have parts like NPCs giving you dialogue at different triggers as you progress through the level. Would you consider that level design, narrative design, or both?
So in an industry context, that would be called a bark, right?
Yeah,
so
yeah.
barks are definitely within narrative design, I would say. You might kind of couch that in saying that that's more like pure games writing as opposed to design. I kind of like wishy-washy. I'm kind of going to be interchangeable when I'm talking about games writing and narrative design, just because that's my background. But barks would definitely fall underneath that category for sure. Yeah. Did you have a question?
I did, and I did, and I still do.
That was branching path. No, sorry. No, go ahead. Sorry. Sorry. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
With that example, playing games, I find that it's a illusion of choice.
Yeah.
That we're kind of constructing.
Yep.
Are we going to get into how choices matter? Like, do choices actually matter?
Right.
And how to construct that.
Yeah, we're going to look at a little bit of techniques about that. Yes, we're absolutely going to be talking about that a little bit, for sure. Choices matter to me, I think, is really interesting / funny. Because I think all choices matter in games. You as kind of self-aware cognitive agents, right? Like picking up controllers and deciding to do things within games and playing them how we prefer to play them. Those are specific choices, right? But when we talk about choices matter type game design, that's like Clementine in the Last of, or not the Last of Us, the Walking Dead games, right? Where you do something or you make a choice and the character remembers, right? And the game engine and the design of that game tells you you did something, right? So that's definitely narrative design, and I hate that narrative design because I feel like it treats players very stupidly. I think that choices inherently shouldn't have to be quantifiable for them to be meaningful, right? You shouldn't need to have a pop-up on the screen that says, hey, you did something, buddy, right? For it to still land and have import and meaning to you, right? I think that this would be just as powerful as an example if there wasn't a thing up in the upper level, left-hand corner, and it was just Clementine looking at you with that doe-eyed face. It would still land in the same way without you having to have that text on the screen. Exactly, right. It would still, I think my kind of design bet or gamble in that way is that it would still have that it would still land in that way that it's intending to be designed. That's my own soapbox, and I'll step off of it from here. But we're going to be looking at, definitely to answer your question, we're going to be looking at techniques to think about how you can get towards some effective emotional response from your players, for sure. Okay, so, but I think kind of more importantly, we kind of think about like why we want to incorporate narrative design into your games. And there's kind of like easy answers to this, right? Narrative design enhances gameplay, right? When we have rich story and rich lore and rich characters and rich dialogue, it makes the game more interesting. It makes the game more engrossing. It makes the immersiveness of that experience just that much more heightened, right? Stories always will engage the player at some level, even if you're not a person that's like, I love narrative games. When a story hits, it hits, right? When it lands with you, it's always going to land with you. That's kind of, again, a bet that I would make. The other thing is that narrative design and making games with narrative focus is a really handy way of setting a particular tone. And we're going to look at an example of that really quickly. But it's also a really creative space for people that don't consider themselves to be writers to experiment, right? To find their own tone, to find their own voice, to find different ways in which they're communicating ideas to the player that aren't just like button mashing, right? And it's also a collaborative opportunity, right? It's an opportunity for you to work with other individuals, other writers, other people that are interested in crafting worlds, to think about how their stories can enhance the thing that you're making. So we have some like examples of like kind of quote unquote pinnacles of narrative design, or maybe not pinnacles, but it's certainly like good examples. These are just some screenshots up here. This is Disco Elysium. This is Oblivion Remastered because I want it to be topical. And this is True Colors. Yeah, Life is Strange True Colors. Thank you so much. By Deck 9. These are, frequently, maybe not Oblivion as much, but the other two are definitely frequently examples of kind of, good narrative design, right? Narrative design where the story is compelling, the characters are very fully fleshed out, but they're also integrated into the mechanics in a very seamless and compelling way. But narrative design doesn't always have to be this like very, intense story or this big character arc or stuff like that. It can also be quite small, right? It can also be the quips that the Balatro Joker gives you, right? So much of the tone of that game is set by that person, right? By that NPC, right? The way that they mock you, the way that they are pithy, the way that they are disposable, the way that they are trying to take advantage of your vulnerability of not getting high scores. That's narrative design. And we would never point to Balatro and be like, oh, the narrative design of Balatro is incredible, right? But it helps set tone. It's extremely important in thinking about the struggle that's going on, not getting too heady, but the struggle that's going on with playing that game. Again, some kind of other Godot examples, thinking about how narrative design is so important in the case of Golden Idol, right? The way in which that game shows you how to play it is done through text. through notes, through journals, right? Not only does it provide you mechanical clues to solve the puzzles in that game, but it also gives you flavor about what those characters are doing with one another and informs the kind of inference that you have to do as the deductive process of that game. And then another kind of more recent example is in Dawnfolk, another Godot-based game. That game, I would never think about as being a narrative game, but there is an NPC that talks to you and tutorializes you and gets you through the game, and also approaches some of the thematics of the game, light versus darkness, right? Again, it's not this heavy, intense, overarching narrative, right? But it still is narrative design. So, okay, coming back off of my soapbox. Okay, cool. So those are some examples, right? I want us to think about, these, right? These really big epic stories, these, games that have very complex narratives to them, where choices matter and the story is very rich and deep and dense, and things where a Joker makes fun of you for not getting a high score, right?
I think the Bellotro lines are so iconic sometimes that one of my friends' Halloween costume was the Wheel of Fortune card, and on the back where it says, Nope.
Nope. Yeah. And again, I think that that's like, I think that, it's no surprise that like Bellotro is a very polished game, right? It's a very polished experience, but that's even at that level, right? So, all right. So I've answered some questions about like what we're thinking about when we're thinking about narrative design, but I think I also want to answer a question of why using ink, the tool that we're going to be using today. I have kind of two answers to this. One of the answers is that it's very convenient for me to be able to plug into Godot. It's very well designed as a piece of software to be very portable. So you can use it within Godot, you can use it within Unity, you can use it within Unreal, you can use it across a lot of different platforms. It's extremely lightweight, it's all text-based, it has a pretty low bar of entry in terms of having technical knowledge, but it has a very high ceiling in terms of high operability and functionality. The other reason is because it's open source, right? Yay, yep, yeah. Heck yeah. So it's open source, you can download the source code, you can modify it, you can open it up, you can do whatever you want to it. It has a very active and supportive community, just like Godot does. There's a specific Godot channel in the Ink Discord where people are sharing projects and so on and so forth. So I think that it's kind of a nice hand in glove with some of the core, how could you say, community aspects of what kind of Godot stands for. But also more importantly, especially for this workshop, is that, I kind of said this before, but it's a very low bar of entry. We can kind of hit the ground running quite easily and quite quickly. Hopefully, knock on wood, okay. So that being said, let's get started. So that's narrative design. Good night. No, so we're gonna open up Inky all together. So if you haven't had a chance, make sure that you go and download that link. The link here, it's just link tree / Godot _ GodotCon, _ND. And then make sure you can just click on this first little website here, and then here's your downloads. Cool. So when we first open Inky, we're going to get a screen that looks like this. And this is basically just the default starting template. And this is deceptively simple. What it proposes to you here, you basically have once upon a time, right? Y'all can read, which is great. But you have these two choices, right? And they both ostensibly point to the same end, right? We're going to get a little bit more complex than this, but you can see that the barrier of just getting the thing up and running and started and starting to do some writing is quite low, which is extremely handy for us. So we're going to write some stories together. We're going to write some stories. They're not going to be super complex stories, but I have, as all good educators should have, I have some guidelines, okay? So I want us to spend, so we're at a little bit 10 past 3, so I want us to spend like maybe 20 to 25 minutes to write a story that has these guidelines. And I'm going to go through how we write some of the stuff in just 1 second, okay? I'm going to start to introduce some of the core concepts of how we write in Ink, and then I'm going to let you write your own stuff. Cool? Okay, I'll come back to this and I'll have this back up on screen. All right, so how do you write in the software? So we're going to take this. I'm just going to select all, just Control A. And I need to plug in my PC. Oh my God. And I'm going to delete that and plug in my PC. Yeah. Yes. I told you, I'm not that sophisticated. Okay, so let's do this. Oh, shoot. Did I unplug? I'm good. Okay, cool. Sorry about that noise. So we have a / here. That's our story. No, just kidding. Okay, so we're going to write in the story. And the way that, that ink works is that it kind of works through these series of what are called knots, okay? They have knots and choices and what are called diverts. I'll have a slide that shows you kind of this vocabulary stuff, where we're gonna write this stuff together. So we're gonna just kind of recreate a little bit, a more complex conversion of this kind of demo thing that we saw here, okay? So we're gonna say, oh, hi. This is a branching story. And the syntax for using Inky is that when we have choices, we use a star to initiate that we're about to write a choice, okay? And so we can say choice 1. And then we can do another star, and we can say choice 2. Now, in order for these to be kind of activated as choices for us, we need to give a little bit more syntax to illustrate that they're going to be kind of active selecting choices. So we're going to put some brackets around these. And Ink is going to do some kind of live compiling for us. And even though we've designated some choices here, we don't see them on the screen. The reason for that is because those choices go nowhere, right? There's no follow-up text to after making these choices. So as a result, these choices aren't going to show us anything because they're not available to point in any particular direction, right? And this is where the kind of key component of using Ink or Inky is going to kind of hopefully land for y'all. We're going to use knots and diverts, which is again the kind of the syntax language of using this, to point these choices to particular branches, okay? So let's make those branches really quickly. I'm going to come down in my text here, and Ink handles white space pretty forgivingly. So I'm going to do 3 equal signs, and I'm going to say something like branch _1, and that will be our first knot. And I'm going to, don't worry about the error for now, and I'm going to make branch _2 to be kind of the second branch where our second choice is going to point to. Now we're getting these errors because currently there's no text, right? There's no story in these branches, and that will kind of provide an error, right? We need to have some content in these, what are called knots, right? These spaces, in order for the story to compile correctly. So I'm just gonna very simply say like, you chose the first choice. And then here, I'll do the same thing. Great. And you're gonna get an additional warning here. Oh, we actually wanna make sure that this is like this, I think. You're gonna get an additional warning here that's going to indicate to you that you want to tell the software, or excuse me, you want to tell the storytelling to basically come to a conclusion, right? Because if you don't, the way that Ink works is that it's a very sequentially compiled type of software. So if you don't have a kind of end state, it won't run properly. But luckily for us, there's a very simple markup to say that we're at the end, and we're going to have these end. So I'm just doing dash, right? I'm making a little forward dash, and I always get this wrong, but that's greater than, right? Is that right? Greater than? Okay, cool. Dash greater than, and then end. And now we need to hook up the choices that we made to these knots. And that uses this thing called diverts. So it's the same syntax as our end here. So we do kind of dash, and we can say branch underscore 1. And this goes to branch underscore 2. And we're going to make sure that we go all the way back in our story. Sorry, I should have kind of gone through the interface up here. This over here is our story, and this is here where we can play our story in real time as it compiles. So if you want to go all the way back to the start of your story, you can click this back button, this restart story, and then this button next to it will just go back one, not choice, but one kind of section of text. Cool? And so now, when we click on choice 1, so nice. And then we go to choice. Oh my God, it's amazing. All right, great. Yes. Okay. Let's relax. Okay. So this is just the basics, right? So, but this is at its core, right, what branching narratives are about, right? We're going to look at, again, some techniques to think about how we can design these systems to, not be these infinite branches, right? But that we can kind of start to fold these back into each other so that they don't spill into a mess, ostensibly, both for designers and for our brains. But we want to get a little bit more complex than this, right? So when we're thinking about design, that design element to narrative design, what's something that's missing here?
Purpose.
Well, okay, yeah, besides like the really kind of important stuff about like narrative, right? When we're thinking about design, right? Design is, when we were talking back before about what design does, it marries story with what?
Variables.
Gameplay, right? And in gameplay, when we're thinking about narrative design gameplay, what's something that we can utilize as a designer to affect gameplay? Variables. Absolutely. So we want to integrate variables into this very simple design, right? So the way that we design, or the way that we integrate variables into ink is that we typically are going to design, or we're going to designate those variables at the very top of our text. I do this not only for organizational sake, but also to know that when I'm restarting my text, that I'm going to be restarting my variables at their default state. Cool? So the syntax for that is very simple. You go var, and then you give that variable name. I'm going to give my variable name choice, and I'm going to set it to a blank string. Now, ink is limited in that it only takes base variable types, right? So what are some of those types, just like as a quick refresher? So we have strings, right? That's up here already. Integers, booleans. Oh. Say what? Like you can, but it doesn't handle it super well. Floats, right? We're gonna kind of stick with those 4, right? For all intents and purposes. Okay. The reason why it doesn't take arrays is because the way that this will output is that it's going to be outputting a JSON file, which then when you have nested arrays becomes a little bit mind blending, right? Not for you necessarily as a designer, but on the back end of how it exports the files. Cool? Okay, so we have this blank variable, right? We want to change and modify this variable in our text, right? That's like what we're all here to do. That's like narrative design. So all we have to do in our branches is that we call that variable with a tilde. And then actually, you know what? Can everybody see this? I didn't even say that before. Is that like more legible? That's probably better for people in the back. Yeah? Cool. Great. So we call our variable by doing a tilde, and we just say choice. And then we set it to a new value, right? So I'm going to set this to be choice 1. Cool. And then in my second branch, I'm going to kind of do the same thing. Except this time, I'll set it to choice 2. And because I'm like a really sophisticated narrative designer, I'm going to try to, at every available option, get rid of my hard-coded statements and use dynamic and polymorphic variables whenever I can, because I'm such a cool person, I don't know. So we're going to get rid of this kind of at the end of these statements, and I'm going to replace them with the syntax of calling this variable, right? So you chose squiggly brackets, choice. Okay, and we'll do that down here too. Oops. So just to kind of put this in practice, right? We get the output, the desired output that we want here, where it's displaying the string that we loaded into the variable once we visited that knot. Okay? So again, very simple, very rudimentary, very kind of like bare bones, right? But we're just laying the foundation. Cool? All right, so what I want us to do was, yes, please. Say what?
Is there a way to put comments?
Oh, yes, I think it uses HTML commenting, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, /**.
Move forward.
2?
That's for blocks.
It uses both. Yep, that one is for multiple lines.
Yeah, that's how it works.
C++ complex.
Hash number sign? Oh, just like this? No. Oh,
That's something different.
that's something different.
You can just say.
Don't you get ahead of me. Just kidding. Okay, so yes, great question. Absolutely. You can tell that I'm not like a programmer because I like don't comment my code. So I do comment my actual code, but I don't comment my narrative design stories because I'm that kind of sicko. So okay, but that's how you comment. Cool. Great question. Okay, so now that we have a little bit of foundation, we're gonna build off of this, but we need some actual story. We actually need meaning, right? We need purpose, and like it was described before. So put on your story hats and create a story that has a dialogue between two characters, okay? That has at least 4 knots, and again, each one of these kind of equal sign segments is a knot, okay? 2 different knots with 2 choices, 2 to 3 variables, and then 1 logic check. Don't worry about that last one for right now. We're gonna get there. So let's start with these first 4. And so again, yeah, it's about 320. So let's spend like maybe 10, 15 minutes. So we'll check back in 3:30, and I'm gonna do this up here too.
For the dial for doing a character, can you put the character name and then like colon to distinguish like who's speaking?
So for right now, what we're gonna do, great question, Rob. What we're gonna do is, let's see. We're gonna do something like Nancy says, "Hi, Rob." It's like I said that in like a very like HAL 9000 way. Yeah. Hello, Rob. Right? So we can start with this, but we're going to come back to this using these 2 characters. So yeah, Rob is taking a little peek behind the curtain here. We're going to create a little bit more sophisticated way of doing this kind of markup. But for right now, you can kind of quote unquote hard code it in each one of those knots. Cool? Any other questions about these kind of thingies here? I'm gonna do some of this too with everybody. So if you need some inspiration, you can just copy me. Okay. So. Oops. Oops. Append variables. What do you?
Yeah, like if we had like speakers, you have like Rob, and then add like comma Joe, if they like pick different option. So then like that makes sense.
Yes, it does. So again, the way that ink kind of operates is that it always operates in a kind of linear fashion. So if and we'll kind of get into structure stuff in the second-ish half of what we're going to be looking at. But when you revisit previous knots, if you do ever revisit previous knots, the choices that you made previously aren't going to be shown. It's one of the kind of disadvantages of using this software or using the system. But if you did that, it would overwrite the value. So it kind of like the value carries it. With some concatenation, so like I think you can do.
It doesn't need to be an array, just like a string of like.
Yes, so you can add to existing variables, right? So like for instance, if you had an integer variable, you wouldn't have to do, you wouldn't have to hard code it. You could do plus equals to that variable. I can't remember. I would say try it and let me know, but I can't remember if it does that kind of concatenation. Yeah.
To work for the next parts of the workshop. It's out in one match, and for whatever reason, it's not working.
Oh no.
We're trying to, use, but yeah, do I need the program itself?
You can use the template. I hope that you can use the template file that I have to at least kind of do some poking around. Cool. All right, so just another couple minutes. Again, we want to keep this really small, really kind of simple, nothing too complex, too overly verbose.
If I may not serve anyone, does anyone else have an M1 match? And I'm just going nuts. No? Cool.
I have a
No.
M3.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure.
Okay. This is an important note. I just got an error about here, but this end kind of divert to like officially end, you want it to be all caps. So that's a built-in, for lack of a better term, kind of function of ink, right? So if you do that lowercase, it's not going to read that end as the kind of intended route that you're wanting to make. Huh?
I do think you are in engineer soul.
I've just learned how to fake it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's kind of you to say, but yeah. To learn how to fake it. Okay. I think we're doing like pretty good on time. We're like a little over, but I think we're okay. Yeah. Just trying to think. So like 3:45 is when we should start kind of going to the, but I think we're okay. Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Thanks. Okay. So pencils down. No, just kidding. So it's okay if you haven't finished up what you're currently working on. You can always come back to the story. You have the software now. You're starting to learn the tools. You're starting to learn how to start to design some of the stuff. We're going to look at some techniques that you can start to integrate into these designs and into these branching stories. But we really want to start with just something really basic and small. Okay. So the key thing here is, as you're wrapping up this little segment, just make sure that you get to some kind of conclusion from each one of your branches. Even if one of your branches is kind of like hanging out there and doesn't have a finished story arc, right? Story arc. Just make sure that you're kind of getting to a point where like that has a conclusion. Cool? Yes?
Can you make it like go to a branch and then put some text up on the screen and then not branch and just sequentially put other bit of text up on the screen?
Yeah? So we're going to look at ways in which you can read this story file in Godot, and Godot will handle that kind of stuff. Does that answer your question?
So,
Okay,
yeah, we'll see.
cool. If not, let's revisit it. Okay, cool. You're saying like have text appear on the screen that is not a choice.
Yeah, like I want it to, like, it's right before it says the end. I want it to say you got X, which is the variable.
Cool. Yeah, for sure. I mean, the simple answer to that is that you can make an additional not that displays that information. Or you can have Godot read those variables and display some text based upon that information, which we are going to get to. Cool. Okay, so let's play my narrative because I'm very proud of it. There once was a conference. It was called GodotCon. I went to this awesome workshop. At the workshop, I met me. Oh, hello, Nicholas. Nice to meet you. Did you like the workshop? Heck yes. Heck yes. Heck yes. Right? The only appropriate response to heck yes is just mirrored back confirmation. Okay, so again, we're really thinking about small scope here. It's not this like huge epic, right? But really thinking about working small and working kind of at a scale that's really manageable for just understanding with what we're doing. So just taking a look at how I've tried to structure my story, we'll kind of move on to the next section in just 1 second. But as a kind of a good, how could you say, what's the term that I'm looking for? A good practice, right, or a good modeling, the way that typically you would write interactive and branching stories within Ink, it can be totally up to you. It's totally preferential. But the practice that I've seen, and I think that the practice that a lot of the people that use this tool typically use, is that you go from the first choice down. So if you kind of look at how I've structured this, I had my 2 choices, Nicholas and Rob. I did those knots first, even though I had other knots that were leading elsewhere, right? And then, I did my workshop. I did all my workshop stuff first. I got to the conclusion where I knew that I was going to be branching back together, right? And then I went back and I did that first branch towards lunch, right? Which I knew I was going to be branching back together. So again, this can be totally up to you. This can be however your brain works, right? However you are thinking about how you want to structure your story. But as long as the diverts that you're using, the things that you're pointing to other branches, are consistent and they have their own kind of flow and logic to them, then it kind of doesn't quite matter what order you're writing it in, as long as you make sure that you're pointing it to the correct place. Cool? One other thing that I just want to kind of point out here is that not all of the text, and I should have said this before, but not all of your text has to be branching. It doesn't always have to contain a branching choice. So if, for instance, I wanted to create a story, right, or if I wanted to create a scenario where I wanted to, let's say I had very limited screen space within my design, right? The UI director for my project or myself was like, my text box is only this big and I can only fit one sentence per time the text box comes in, right? You're like, okay, well that's a design limitation that I have to deal with and I have to contend with. So I can't have two sentences appear at the same screen at the same time, but I don't want a branch to happen here. I just want to be able to continue, right? What you can do is that you can create a choice, right? That, let's just say, is something like continue. And then if you make a dash after that choice, it will just allow you to continue kind of along that same knot without having to go to a brand new knot, right? So that's a way where you can kind of do some kind of organizational story flow, right, of getting those beats and measures and having particular moments of your story land at particular times, right, or as you're reading it, right, without having to have branches, right, or having to go to a wholly unique or discrete knot, right? So we'll get into kind of how to think about structuring that stuff in a little bit. But I did want to show you that because, you're probably asking yourself, well, I've read plenty of narrative design stories that don't have these branching stuff, and you can do that here too, right? Again, the choice, think about the choice as not being necessarily always a branch, but a thing that you're having the player interacting with to advance the story. Cool? All right, so I wrote the story. It is so good, and I'm so proud of it. I'm going to be saving it in two different ways. So I'm first going to just save it as an ink file. And so you can save this into anywhere on your desktop, or if you downloaded those project files, you can go into those project files. You should see like a folder that says ink in there. You can save it in there. You can save it wherever you feel like. Again, this is kind of the project file that I have there, and I have this ink file. I'll call this like GodotCon demo, something like that. Something really innocuous. So then after saving the ink file, I also want to save a JSON file. So when we're going to be incorporating this story into our Godot project, it's going to be reading and interpreting a JSON file and kind of deserializing that, unpacking that, and then loading it as discrete story text that then we can read very easily. Okay? So I'm going to do Control-Shift-S. Again, this is a bug that always happens in Inky for some reason. If you just go to Open Recent, I should have anticipated this, but if you go to File at the top, this happens only after when you save the ink for the first time. At least it does for me. It might be different for you. But if you just go to Open Recent and you just like reopen this one, it'll open it in a new window. If you go to File, and then you want to go to Export to JSON, or again, Control-Shift-S, and we'll save it in the same folder. But in order to make sure that we're exporting this correctly, what I always try to do, and this is again just kind of a peculiarity of using this tool, is that I really try to name the convention. So I'll save it as the same project file name, but I'll do .inc.json, JSON. Cool? And again, that's just to ensure that the thing that I'm exporting here isn't accidentally writing over the ink file, but instead is exporting a JSON file that's going to be the thing that we're going to be reading. Cool? Any questions about that, or anybody need me to go through that one more time?
Getting this weird thing and saying that my thing is not.
Yeah, so I had the same experience. So if this is just a kind of kooky error, it looks like this, right? It's a bug. It's a common bug in using ink. I don't know the source of why it does this, but the way that I get around that is that I go up to File and I go to Open Recent and I just reopen the demo file in a new window and then save it from there. You can also close Inky and then just reopen the file. This is just kind of a quicker way of doing that. Again, this only happens the first time that you save your project file. After doing this, you shouldn't get that error. And again, unfortunately, it's just a known issue. Cool? Okay, so we've written our stories. We're going to be incorporating that into Godot, but I think it would be a kind of a good moment for us to think about narrative design as a tool, as a structure, and to think about some good kind of common best practices, or maybe not even best practices, but to think about some types of practices that exist within narrative design techniques. Oh, I'm gonna kind of leave this title slide up here. Before we get to that, again, just kind of reinforcing some of the vocabulary that we're gonna be using, or that I'll be using over the course of this workshop, and that you'll probably use as you're using this tool. Again, we have our variables at the top. We have our choices, which are designated by a star. And then we have our nots, right? And then we have our diverts, which are the things that go to another not. Okay, and this is actually the ink file that's in the Godot visual novel example that you got from the initial list of things on the link tree. Some other things that we're going to come back to the story and try to incorporate are going to include things like tags, a little bit of logic, right? And by logic, I'm really thinking about some conditions like if statements and stuff like that, to be saying if some things are meeting certain conditions, then just display certain types of text. And then thinking about what I just told you, which is thinking about choice flow, right? That thing about just like having continue so that you're not going to a brand new not or a brand new divert, but you're just kind of continuing the story for the sake of pacing the text that you have. Okay, again, we're going to come back to thinking about tags and logic. I think I heard somebody here say like, oh, if you also use hashtag, that works. That's a tag. Cool. Cool. Again, we're going to come back to this because we're going to be using these things later on. Okay, so some techniques. Cool. So we have a variety of different techniques that we can employ within our projects. I'm going to go over 4 techniques that I found kind of don't necessarily cover all of the different ways that narrative design exists within projects, but these are definitely some common pillars that you'll see narrative designers use within their projects that I think that you should also think about how to, internalize and incorporate into your own projects. So the first one is called the story stack. The story stack is a concept developed by Jason Vanderberg for designers and developers that are thinking about story and mechanics. This is a concept that designers would incorporate very early on in the design process. So very frequently writing and narrative design in kind of larger workflows or in larger kind of whatever AAA productions, the writing aspect would happen quite late in the process, right? And sometimes is only slapped on, somewhat after all of the mechanics have been in place and after maybe even a prototype has actually been fully developed, right? So what Jason Vanderberg kind of argues for here is to think about your points of flexibility, right? Where are you most flexible and least flexible within your writing and your design, and how do you incorporate that into the larger mechanical structure of your project, right? This type of approach is what I would call a more player-centric approach to narrative design. It's not as authory or prosy, but is very much more serviceable towards the kind of central gameplay mechanic, and it's kind of a little bit more like player-centric, right? So what we have here, this might be a little bit hard to read on the projector, but what we have here is that at the top we have a less flexible framework, and then near the bottom we have a more flexible framework. What's something that kind of jumps out to y'all in just like this little slide? Like what's something that might be a little bit surprising? Yeah. Right.
I think
I think in traditional storytelling context, that seems very counterintuitive, right? We think about when we're writers or authors, right? Plot is like the central thing, right? It's like the thing that everything revolves around. You go from point A to point B, you have characters, and so on and so forth, right? But what Jason Vanderberg would argue is that in games, in game writing and narrative design, it's a much different way of thinking about how you're actually going about creating that work, right? Creating that story, right? And he would argue that instead the highest priority that you have and the least flexible thing that you have is that you're having the player embody some kind of fantasy, right? Yes?
It's like you care more about the moment-to-moment experience, so the plot should just facilitate that kind of the idea, like
Oh.
the plot follows.
Yeah, a little bit. Let's go through this diagram and we'll kind of get towards, I think, a little bit of what you're talking about, right? It's more that in Jason Vanderberg's argument, he would say that the most important thing for your players to experience isn't those fine details of plot, right? But that they feel like what they should be feeling like, right? So when you're selling a game, for instance, and this is, again, this kind of type of thinking is much more popular and pervasive within like a AAA model, right? So in AAA models, right, you're like playing a Spider-Man, right? So the but the player fantasy in that is that you got to make sure that whatever the writing is, whatever the narrative design is, that you don't forsake being Spider-Man, right? That's the least flexible thing. If there's something in your writing that betrays that fantasy, then you've lost the player, right? So if you are writing, if you're creating some narrative design for, a Spider-Man like game, very common game genre, Spider-Man likes, right? If you have Peter Parker as a complete a-hole, right? Like that betrays this like sensibility of our knowledge of what we think about that character, right? If if Spider-Man doesn't shoot webs, right? Then like what are we even doing here, right? Like, so that's kind of a more along the lines of what we're talking about, and that being the least flexible, right? What's the selling point of your game? What's the selling point of that player fantasy? And as a writer, you have to kind of work within the confines of whatever you're really selling to that experience, right? As you kind of get further down this, you can kind of think about how then you're facilitating to a certain extent that top level fantasy, right? So what are the actions that you do as that fantasy, right? You, again, in this example, web sling, or you fight crime, or you rescue cats, or whatever it is, right? You perform these different actions, and that's, again, from a design perspective, something that's, again, the least flexible. You perform these things in order to fulfill that fantasy. What is the economy? What are the resources that you have a designer to then perform those actions, right? So each one of these are kind of, lumping upwards up this stack, right? Then how does the world facilitate that economy, facilitate that resource, right? And then how does the plot then facilitate that world? Yes?
Could you elaborate a little bit on economy in that and how you... I'm a little bit lost.
Sure, no problem. So economy I think of as being a little bit of somewhat of a misleading word. I like, if I were to redesign Jason Vanderberg's terminology here, I would think about resources, right? So it's not like what cash that you pick up on the street and then you use, right? But what do you do, like what are you doing, because that would be actions, but what are the things that you are, what rewards do you get from performing those actions that then further the plot, or further, the narrative design, right? So in this structure, right, like maybe lunch is an economy, right? So in order to progress the story, you need to have lunch because you're hungry, right? So the action that you would do is that you would go to lunch, right? But the economy of that is getting lunch, right? It's kind of like, what is the gameplay mechanic element that then unlocks something about leading upwards in this fantasy, right? My fantasy here is about going to an awesome workshop and getting a heck yes, right? So like, it's a little bit smaller scale. And again, this isn't kind of the only way of doing this. This is a kind of a thought process. So the economy section is thinking about what is available to you mechanically to incentivize the player to continue to perform this fantasy.
getting more sync to probably like right.
So like, or like experience points, right? Something like that. Or maybe it could be a more hard, fast economy. Maybe it's like you collect cash, right? Maybe it is that something where you're doing something to unlock other aspects of the game.
Heck yeah.
Getting a heck yes, right? Like getting a high five, right? Getting whatever it is, completing a quest, right? These things that are resources within the game that advance that fantasy, right? Does that help answer your question? Cool. So then as you're kind of like moving down this, then you start getting into details, right? Then you start getting into the plot and the world, right? So in the plot, right, the plot for, there's a lot of, again, I hate going back to Spider-Man, right? But there's a lot of different plots that you can employ within that narrative universe, right? We're not going to get into multiversal stuff, but like there's a lot of different storylines that you can think about where you want to take that player fantasy to, right? And in that way, you kind of have a lot of options available to get the player to be the person that you want them to be, right? Again, this is not, I don't think you can apply this to all different types of narratives. This is just a technique for thinking about how you can design certain structures and systems, right, based upon the type of gameplay that you're going for. I think that this is a very player-centric approach, right? This is going to be for like your Steam Power users that are gonna want to like zone out when they're playing their games and like be whatever, Space Marine, right? Or something like that, or whatever it might be. I think it's geared towards that type of audience, right? Yes?
What kind of trade-offs do you experience with this particular?
I like telling stories. I like telling particular stories. And I like telling stories in my studio that are about really nuanced and introspective, thought-provoking type of material. So I would use a different technique. I would use a combination of this technique. I use this technique a lot called multiple middles. It's a concept developed by game designer Hannah Nicklin for doing branching narrative type design, and also for kind of choice-driven stories. It's instead of it being, she kind of proposes this as opposed to thinking about creating branching narratives that have these kind of multiple endings, right, where your choices stack up along the way. Instead, you kind of have more moment-to-moment choices that maybe are affecting your interpersonal relationships between a cast of characters or NPCs or an ensemble, right? So you have these moments of resolution along the way as opposed to building up to this one massive resolution at the end, right? I would think of this as being a more author-centric approach, right? So it's not so much leaning on designing something that's going to be capturing that player fantasy, but instead is going to be capturing on what are the interpersonal relationship between the player and maybe the playable character and the cast of characters that you're experiencing and interacting with, right? So it kind of serves both a technical framework for thinking about how to prevent these infinite branching spaces, right? But also a storytelling framework to think about how you can create some space for a character to grow and develop and then bring it back towards a central arc, right? So you kind of have moments where you expand a little bit, you explore some lore, you explore some world building, you explore some backstory, you explore some poetry and prose perhaps, right? But then those things kind of start to fold back in towards the central motivating character arc, right? Or story arc. Cool?
So like you might always wind up at the end of your game sitting down to dinner with a friend, but sometimes they might be pissed and sometimes they might really like you.
Yes.
Okay.
I would say more, that's a great, I would play that game. I was just thinking about like, how would I design that game? I think for Hannah Nicklin, again, I'm kind of presenting other people's ideas here, and I don't mean to speak for Hannah. She's amazing, and she has this wonderful GDC talk that talks about it in detail. But I think for Hannah, it would be more that you have plans to go sit down with your friend at the end of the day and have a wonderful meal, right? But you make a choice somewhere earlier on in that day that makes them maybe decide not to cook their favorite meal for you, right? So it's not so much about having multiple endings per se, but that the world is kind of changing and responding to the way that you decide to play the character that you're playing with other kind of fully fleshed out characters. Cool. Like similar, yeah, but I don't think it would be. I think for Hannah, it wouldn't be as definitive of being like you unlock the pissed ending, right? It would be more that like the ending will happen anyways, but it's more about the process along the way than it is about the conclusion.
Changes the seasoning of the story.
Yes, flavor, I think, is a term that I hear a lot about this. I think a game that executes this very, very well is Kentucky Route Zero. Kentucky Route Zero has a lot of branching narrative, a lot of different dialogue options, but it has kind of finite conclusions to it, right? And the way that the flavor of that world is designed and the way that you choose to engage with those flavors is, I think, really rich and rewarding and beautiful and poetic. So I think it's again more author-centric, right? It's more like I have a particular voice that I want to hone and articulate and design within the craft of my storytelling, and it's maybe less about what the player's fantasy is, in their gameplay. Does that make sense? Yeah, maybe. I'm just thinking about that game idea. Sorry. So it would maybe be more that like the NPC doesn't change, but maybe you changed. Do you see what I'm saying? Like maybe like you go to sit down at dinner and maybe you're pissed, right? Not the NPC, right? Okay, so moving on. This is an example of a branching dialogue tree from Disco Elysium. This Disco Elysium uses, I think, similarly this kind of multiple middles concept. I don't know if they've directly referenced Hannah Nicklin. I can't say for them, but this is like an example of you have these kind of points where things kind of branch out. You have all this detail, but then you can kind of sense that they start to funnel back towards central branching points or central kind of points of whatever moving the story along. And maybe they branch out again and then they kind of come to another conclusion, right? So thinking about the structure of the way that your narrative is being designed, I think is also important to kind of keep into consideration. This is Artisy Draft. It's different from Inkle. It's a different software altogether. But I think thinking about this structurally is sometimes helpful. And this is like anyways, you can find this. It's on the internet. Okay. Another technique that I would want to highlight is called the layer cake method. I really like this method, and I don't employ it enough in my own narrative design. But it's a type of narrative design technique that works particularly well for adventure and or action games. It's a technique where you deliver the most pertinent and the most kind of high-level type of details to the player upon first interaction. And then if the player is interested in narrative or wants to find out more, the NPC that they're talking with or maybe the room that they're interacting with has more details and more kind of world-building elements to it that could potentially help you out further on in your quest or reveal more details about what you might need to take with you upon retrieving something, right? This is a technique that's been attributed to the Far Cry 2 narrative director, Patrick Redding, and it's kind of been further expanded upon by another fantastic narrative designer and teacher, Susan O'Connor. They kind of both attributed this, they have pointed to multiple different points of where this is done very effectively. I've found a good kind of more recent example of this is Outer Worlds or Obsidian-based games made by the Obsidian studio. They do this, I think, this par excellence. If you think about like Fallout New Vegas is like a really good example of that. So like you go and you talk to an NPC and they're like, hey, go over there and get me something. And you're like, okay, well, what are you making me do? And they're like, well, actually, if you go do that, it's like pretty complicated, right? And then you get more detail and story and lore and kind of enrichment of your environment. But if they're like, hey, I need you to go over there and do this thing, you could be like, all right. And then you leave, right? So it allows for a little bit of flexibility on the part of the player, right? To decide whether or not they want to explore your narrative, your story, deeper than that kind of first blush, right? I think that this technique kind of splits the difference between a player-centric approach and an author-centric approach, right? Because for people that are not interested in storytelling in games and want to go shoot big bugs and collect XP or whatever it is, right? They get that quest and they're like, see ya, right? They're like out the door and they're throwing mini nukes at whatever, right? But for people that are like, I want to know more about what happened, right? Or I want to know more about this person, right? This technique allows for you to have a flexibility and a range of different types of player experiences. I also think that this technique is really interesting and can be really rewarding for narrative designers because it allows you to add that kind of deeper layer of variable-based storytelling. Again, we were talking about before where the technical aspect is like mirroring or sandwiched on top of the storytelling aspect, right? So you, in a layer cake method, when you get into the second layer, let's say, right, besides that first layer of the most pertinent information, right? That second layer maybe says, you know what, actually, now that you're talking to me for more than 2 minutes, I have a secondary objective for you. And if you complete that secondary objective, you're going to get a better reward because you went to the second layer, right? That to me, that's like, wow. Like that's like really nice narrative design. Again, it really depends on the type of story and the type of gameplay experience that you might be designing. But I think it can be a very helpful way of thinking about how you can get that player through the first point of entry and continue going. Yes?
Why do you think that that is a particularly good story design? Because to me, it sounds like you're basically hiding from the player the way to play the game correctly. It sounds like you're creating a correct way to play the game, which is to keep asking because you might get a better reward.
So that is, well, do you want to answer that question?
I mean, I have a strong thought, but I don't want to scoop you.
No, go ahead.
No, I think.
I'm tired of talking.
I was thinking this sounds like rewards exploration. You know, if you have a big empty map, nobody wants to just go see all the mountains you made and stuff. You have to put stuff out there.
Yeah.
And so for some people, just the narrative's enough of a reward, right? If it's a well-written story, I'm going to read every word. But sometimes it's okay, and I need a little reason to dig deeper. I need to reward me for digging deeper.
So I agree with the sentiment, absolutely. I think another way that I would approach that question is that that's your responsibility as a narrative designer. I don't think that you can put that on players, right? I think that it should be up to you to craft something that encourages the type of behavior that you want your player to have, right? This technique allows to have a range of experiences, right? So if you're wanting, I think the way that I would answer that question is that if you think that if you're designing this way as a way of potentially punishing your player, don't do that, right? Don't punish your players, right? It's more about like, if you want to know more, I'll give you more, right? But it's not saying that this is the right or wrong way, right? It's more giving the player an opportunity to play how they might want to, right? So I think that that's really the trickiness and the friction of what you're identifying lies in the writing, right? So if you have an experience, if you use this method, right, and the player comes back to the NPC and they're like, cool, I went out there and I did my thing, and I'm here for my reward. And the NPC says, cool, but you didn't talk to me enough and you could have gotten a better reward, right? That's where I think you fail as a narrative designer, right? You need to make the player at where they're playing at, right? So if that's how they choose to play and they decide to go that route, cool, done, right? But I think then if they come back and you punish them for not doing the thing that you as a writer are really interested in having them explore, then you're doing the player a little bit of a disservice, right? I would also say too, in larger context and larger studio settings, you as a narrative designer aren't going to get a lot of choices, right? You might be just kind of like filling out content a lot of the time, and you might be saying, oh, my poetry and prose is amazing, and I'm a wordsmith and read all my stuff. And the player is going to be like, they're going to be button mashing, right? Yeah, so like I think I totally take your point in hand. I think that concern and that worry should rest on you as a designer and writer and not necessarily on thinking about how you can leverage that point against whoever is experiencing your work. That's just my take, but yeah.
With that being said, right, when it being your responsibility, are there any tips to, like, what's more pertinent to a player? And I guess that depends on the game you're making, but, how do you kind of go about crafting a narrative in a game that, at the very least, is compelling? I guess that's a broad question, right? But, like, sometimes people just want to play the game and not necessarily care about the text.
Totally.
You can say it for later. It's fine. Because I do have a question.
I do.
Narrative design without text.
Yeah. I do want to save it for later, but I also want to like approach it here and say like, I don't know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like that's part of the work.
Yeah.
And that's part of like being a person that's working potentially or hopefully with a team. And that's also part of like the design process where you got to see what sticks, right? Like you could write a novel's worth of stuff and have someone just button mash through it, and that sucks, right? But that's what the player's intention is. Can I give like a brief anecdote? Cool. Okay, so before the project that I made, that I just introduced before, I made this kind of experimental visual novel that was called The Last Survey. And it's very prosy, and it's very heavy, and it's very like cerebral and like thinky. Not like thinking in terms of gameplay, but thinking in terms of a text. It's very introspective, and it deals with complex things. Or so I think. But I brought it to a conference, to a gameplay conference, and the first person sat down, went like this, and they went. And it was at a conference for narrative-focused games. And so, like, in some ways, you're always going to have those players. In some ways, you can't design for everyone, right? And you have to make a choice as a designer of deciding if you want to be, leaning on your authorial voice or leaning on a player-centric approach, right? But yeah, I would say like, some of that can be dictated by genre. Again, I kind of preface this by saying like, this works really well in these kind of action-adventure type games. I don't know if this would work very well in like a puzzle game, right? I don't know if this would work very well with like a choose-your-own-adventure, right? Or yeah, like a sport, like nobody in FIFA is like, oh, tell me the lore, right? Like, they're like, I want to be Messi or whatever, I don't know. Anyway, so like, I think that there's like a little bit of complexity about that. Tom, did you want to say something or?
Yes, I just want to point out we're about halfway through the second set of workshops. So this is as much for you as everyone else, Nicholas. If you want to give them a break, now is somewhere in this general phase.
Cool.
For it.
I'm going to do this one last slide, and then we can take like a 5-minute.
No,
Is that cool?
Whatever you works for
Okay,
you guys.
cool. Thanks, Tom.
Yep.
So yeah, to summarize, like, I think that there's a lot of room, right? And again, I think a lot of genre can sometimes dictate this stuff too. The last kind of general technique, and again, these aren't catch-alls. These aren't the end-all be-all of all the techniques that are out there. These are kind of just pattern recognition of different techniques that I've been able to glean and gloss over the experience that I'm bringing to this workshop. But one other technique that I've seen is this kind of loop and grow type of technique. And this is a technique that's very, that borrows heavily from a choose-your-own-adventure type storytelling. This author, or the person that kind of has identified this or recognized this, is this author and game designer, Sam Cabo Ashwell. And this is an approach where, as you can kind of see in this diagram, this is like the entry point, and then you kind of go through, and these are kind of like hard ending points or maybe like deaths. But through each successive loop, you would have kind of an iterative of variable or an iterative of skill or maybe even an iterative of storytelling, right? But you go through something, this is like, kind of roguelike-y way of thinking about storytelling, right? Where through each pass, you're maybe getting a little bit more information, a little bit more detail, a little bit more world, a little bit more maybe familiarity and experience with the characters and the environment that you're existing within, and that's how you kind of progress through the story, right? Yeah, you can kind of think about it like that. Again, in a choose-your-own-adventure context where this is coming from, you could kind of think about these as like day cycles. So that would be the kind of motif that it would be built around, right? Where you could potentially reach a conclusion at that day, but then that conclusion kind of continues on as you go through that process, or maybe you revisit the work, at a later point, right? I kind of talk about this as being a very system-y approach to narrative design because it is a system, right? It requires knowing what state the player is at what time, and then incrementing up that player state, depending on what loop or cycle or point of visitation that they might be at, right?
It sounds like you would take this narrative too, right?
You know, that's interesting because the gameplay of that is very loopy, but the narrative of that is very linear.
You can't get to it without going through.
That's true. That's true. But I would say that the narrative design of that isn't based upon iterations, right? So if you like die in that game, it's not like then a new hint unlocks and you're like, oh my God. Now I know that. Yeah. Yes.
I think Outer Wilds is probably the golden example for this.
Yeah, Outer Wilds is a great example of that. I always think I think of the Forgotten City. I don't know if people know that game. It was like kind of had this hot moment a while back where it was like this kind of time looping game. That's a kind of a good example. Again, a good kind of mechanical matching narrative kind of design game. Okay, let's take a break. Okay, so those were kind of these four main pillars of different kind of narrative design techniques that I've thought about. Let's take a really quick break because I want to make sure that we're getting the stories that we just wrote into Godot and looking at the actual Godot side of things as well. Cool? So it's about 4:15, so let's come back 4:20, a little bit after 4:20. Cool? Great. We're going to jump back in. We're going to continue on here. And we're actually going to be doing the Godot side of what we're working on. So if you would like to, this is Godot. That was a joke. Okay. Whoa, I've never seen this video. Okay, all right. So,
Not a good example.
so this is the project file that is from the Godot visual novel repo that was posted in those series of links in the link tree. This is a repo that I maintain, but it's free and open, whatever. It's an MIT license. We're going to be working from this getting started scene. So if you want to just open up this scenes folder, we have some stuff here, and then we're going to use this getting started scene. Again, if you haven't finished your story, we can use some resources available to us from this repo just for kind of testing purposes and getting things up and running. And there's not kind of a ton of what I'm kind of doing here besides just kind of setting up a little bit of a project to get us kind of, I'm just kind of doing this for the sake of time because we don't have an infinite amount. So I wanted to just kind of do this for y'all. So this is a template file that's provided by an InkGD and Godot user Avery. And they made, this is actually an updated template file from the original template files that used to come bundled with InkGD. The maintainer of InkGD has been working on other projects and hasn't had a chance to really be updating a lot of the kind of more nuts and boltsy type stuff. So in previous versions of this plugin, there were these template files, and then they were updated by a community member. Thank you, Avery, for doing that. That's really great maintenance work. So this has a lot of comments in it, which is really great, and much more comments than what I was talking about before. But we're going to walk through this template file and kind of think about how it's getting the ink story that we made, the ink JSON file that we made, and starting to then display the information of that JSON file into Godot. Okay? So we're going to build out this very simple scene together to display the stories that you just wrote. Cool? And then to wrap up the end of this, I'll kind of show a little bit more of this repo so that you can look at some of the more details of what Ink can do and some use cases, some very simple use cases of some of its functionality. So at the very top of this file is a simple variable that says ink player. This is a variable that we're going to be pulling from that's loading the inkplayer.gd file from the resources that comes from the InkGD plugin. I'm not going to go that deep into what this plugin is doing, but if there's any functions or any kind of behind the scenes things that you want to look at about how the player works and how it's interpreting some of the JSON information, you can go look at that inkplayer.gd file. Again, that's in the resource, or you can kind of follow the resource link there, or path, I should say, there. And then I added this exported variable here to load in the story that we're going to be putting into this player, ostensibly. And that's just going to be taking a resource. We're going to be dragging and dropping the resource into, basically where this is being stored when we get to that point. Okay. And then one other public node that we're going to be having here is basically when the scene starts, it's going to load an ink player that's taking the loaded resource that we have here, and we're making a new kind of instance of that loaded resource. And then we're doing some kind of complicated stuff here, or not so complicated, but we're doing some stuff at the ready point here where we're adding that ink player that we just kind of instantiated into our scene. We're loading the file that we'll be loading as a resource. Again, we'll get to that. We're going to set this variable here of loading the story in the background. You can kind of see the note here that it's recommended to do so for optimization from an optimization standpoint. And then we're going to connect a signal from the ink player GD to story loaded. That basically is just saying when that story has been loaded, when the resource that we're loading up here has loaded, then start this function. And then to create the story based upon reading the JSON file that we're loading in that loaded story variable. Okay. Any questions? Yes.
So I missed something because I'm not seeing this getting started file anywhere. Was that created on the fly?
It should have been. It's in your scenes folder. It should be. Again, you might have need to go to the GodotCon branch from that repo.
Might be what I'm doing.
Yeah.
Let me double check that.
Yeah. Sorry, I should have emphasized that when it was brought. Okay, cool. Any questions about what's going on here? Again, like if you're just getting started in Godot or you're like not a master of GD scripts, this is why we're using the template. It's because it has this kind of backbone established to it. What we're going to be doing is that we're going to be basically adding out from this template to have this to be readable and displayed in our game. So when we, oh yes.
I don't have that branch because it's not showing up in the branch list. That's what I just said.
Or get forward and you have to look at it.
I'll count it in my capital Z.
Let me just see. It's one word _ ND, and then if we go to this workshop project files, and then it should be not main but GodotCon.
Maybe just download it with like the green buttons.
Yeah, I would just say like instead of trying to clone it, you could just like get the zip file and then bring the scene file and the other template file over. Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I just want to make sure you didn't answer my question yet. We haven't gotten to the part where we are making the actual ink about it, right?
Not yet.
Okay, make sure I didn't miss it.
Yeah. Yeah, but I do want to stress that where that is located, if we actually just click on this node, the getting started node, that's going to be in this loaded story variable in our interface here. And again, I just kind of created that by having this export variable.
Sweet, thanks.
Cool. Any other questions about like what's happening up here in the ready?
If I don't have the JSON, again, this one.
So there is a that's a great question. So there should be this tutorial example.json file in the ink folder that you could work with for our intents and purposes. Awesome, great. Okay, so this story loaded function that's connected to the signal of when our ink story is loaded. It's a very, very simple function here. It basically says that if this hasn't been loaded successfully, then return. But if it has been loaded successfully, then go to continue story. And continue story is really where the kind of bulk of what we're going to be working in. We're going to be using another function here, but this continue story, this kind of public method here is going to be the kind of the big thing that we're going to be working within to get our story to be displayed. Cool. So walking through this public function really quickly, we have this while loop, right? That says that while the ink player can be continued, which basically means that if you are able to read the JSON file that has a line that can be displayed, then it can continue. So while it can continue, we're going to set a temporary variable to be text, and that's going to be based upon this function within the ink player variable that we loaded. We can print that text, but we're going to do something I think a lot more interesting and significant with that. We're going to be setting that. Oh, this is actually maybe left over from what we had before or what I made before, so don't worry about that for now. We're going to be creating that label node, and then we'll be putting the text that we've loaded from this into that label node. We'll do that all together. And then if we have choices, right, if we have those all-important moments where we have these kind of star bracket choices, right, then we want to display those choices in a very particular way. And just as like a kind of thought experiment, how do we think that we're going to want to display those choices within Godot? Like from an actual like node perspective. No, it's okay.
Yes, so you might have like some kind of container with a bunch of labels in it that you populate with text.
So it would be labels, and what are like really good clickable labels? Buttons, absolutely, right? So we're going to be using, you're absolutely right. So we're going to create a little bit of UI that enables us to translate the text that's going to be in those choices to be buttons themselves, right? And we're going to connect those buttons to say, okay, we're going to select the choice when those buttons are clicked, right? And that will kind of allow us then to choose those choices within the ink JSON file to continue our story, right? Cool? All right. And then when we've reached the end, ostensibly, we'll print in the console at the end, because all good stories have that. Just as like a kind of the other main public function that we would be using here is this kind of choosing the choice. I'm going to kind of trip over that a bunch because it's a little bit of a tongue twister, but we're going to be using this other select choice function here that when we click on our buttons, right, that are displaying the choices, they will then choose the index of that choice based upon that moment in the JSON file or in the JSON story. And then once that choice has been chosen, it will then loop back around to that continue story. Cool? So you can kind of think about this system of how this is working as this like loop, right? It loops through continue story and it says, while we can continue that story, we'll display our text and choices that are at those particular moments. Then when you click on choices, it will choose the index of that choice based on an array of the available choices that are there. And it will then return that branch or whatever that's diverting to and continue the story. Cool? Until we reach the end and our computer crashes. No, just kidding. Okay, cool. All right. So let's start building this out in terms of like the actual kind of functionality of what we need from our nodes and from our hierarchy over there, right? So what are some things that we're going to need in order to like display this information? What are some things over in our scene that we're going to need to add? What nodes do we need here?
Like a box.
We're going to need a box. What kind of box?
Text display box.
Yeah, so we're going to need a label that's going to be yes, so we're going to need, yes, but a text box, right? We're going to need to display the text that's being output from our JSON file. So we're going to use a label for that to just, for all intents and purposes. Cool? So I'm going to go up here to my top level node. I can either hit the plus sign or do Control A, and I'm going to search for label. And probably while I'm here, I'm actually just going to replace this. I'm going to replace the name of this and just call this text. If you want to leave it as label, that's fine, but I think for our purposes to make sure that we're all working with kind of same code base, maybe follow along with the naming convention so that you're not like, my thing isn't displaying and it's because you're not referencing the correct node. Cool? So, okay, so we have our label, which is where our story is, and what is the other things that we needed? We kind of mentioned it before. Well, we need some buttons, right? And where are we going to put those buttons?
Voice container or something? Or?
We could put them in a panel. I think for us, like if you wanted to get really cool with UI and Godot, you could put them in a panel. I'm gonna just put them in a container because I hate UI, and so I'm just gonna put them in a container. Okay, so let's add a container here, And I'll do a horizontal container. No, I'll do a vertical container, sorry. VBox container. Cool. Now, we're gonna run into an issue here, right? We're like, we can't necessarily hard code the buttons that we want to have loaded in our container because we want them to be dynamically loaded from ink, right? We can't just say, oh yeah, just like throw some buttons in there and whatever, right? We want to be able to have ink drive the amount of buttons that are going to be loaded in this container, right? So how would we, from a design perspective, how would we kind of create that in Godot?
You just make like instantiate the scene like as a button.
Yep.
And then instantiate that.
Load that in, right, totally. So what we're gonna do is that I'll save this to make sure I don't lose anything, and we're gonna create a new scene that's gonna be our button that we're gonna load in and instantiate depending on how many buttons that we have, right? So I'll click on that plus sign to create a new scene here. I'm gonna go to other node, and I'm gonna say button, and I'll name this choice button, something like that. And I'm gonna make this flat because I told you that I didn't like UI, but I was just kidding. So I'm gonna make it flat just so that we're just displaying text, right? We're not getting like any graphical stuff, right? We just kind of want to display text at this point. Cool. So again, I'm just clicking on this, and then in the inspector over here, I'm just clicking flat so we just have our choice. We don't need to load any text into here because again, ink is gonna handle that information. We don't need to worry about any of that. So this looks good for now, I guess. Yeah, that's fine. We can deal with this. So let's save this as a new scene. I'm gonna try to practice, good practices and put this in my scenes folder. And choice button is not previously set here, so I'll just go ahead and save that. And now, before I do anything else, I'm gonna at least load that into the script that's attached to my getting started node here. Cool? So I'll go up to the top, and you can put this wherever you want to, but I'll say var choice button equals load res, and then I'll look for choice button, scenes, choice button, right? Because again, we want this to be dynamic. We want to instantiate our buttons depending on how many choices we have available to us in the ink story. Cool. How's the speed? Is this good? Some thumbs up? Okay, cool. Great. I saw some thumbs up and then everybody did the thumbs up, so that was really nice. Okay, all right. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna do a couple of things. The first thing that we wanna do is that we want to display the text of our story, right? So when in our continue story function here, we already have something that's printing that text, which is so great. We want to see that story, but we want to put that text into that label that we just created, right? So we'll go ahead and grab that text label node, and we'll say text.text equals text, which is like not confusing at all. Right? So what we're doing is that we're getting the text value right in our label, this thing here, and we're going to put this kind of temporary variable that we've loaded from our ink player into that thing. So before we do anything else, let's see if this actually is going to load correctly. Okay, this is where the rubber meets the road. So let's go ahead and load in that JSON file, right? We're gonna drag that JSON file into our project here. So if we go to getting started at the top here, and you see our exported variable here, I already have this kind of tutorial example, but let's go ahead and try to bring in the JSON file that we saved earlier. I'm just going to drag and drop that into our loaded story. Okay. And now I'm going to, we want to do one more thing. We probably want to do a little bit of formatting to our UI to make sure that we're going to actually see the thing that we want to see, right? So let's go over to the 2D tab. Let's go over to text. And we can keep it anchored to the upper left-hand corner, but I'm gonna move this kind of down and over a little bit just to make sure that it's displayed. And I can bring my VBox container down too. And again, I'm not being too precise with this, but I do want these to somewhat line up. So I'm going to go into the layout and the transform of that component and just see what the position value is. Okay, it says it's at 90, and I'm going to do the same here. Layouts, transform, and oh, I was looking for the X, so I'm so silly. Okay, 57. Whatever. Cool. We're just generally lining them up. Cool. Right, again, we're not being too precise with this because we just want to see that our story is getting loaded. So I'll save this, and I will hit the play button here. And I get cool, see you later. Womp, womp. Right? So what happened? Don't worry, this is expected. But we want to do a little bit of problem solving, critical problem solving. Yep.
Iterated over the whole story of things.
It iterated over my whole story at once. And you know how we can tell that? It's because if we look at the output, right, we actually see the entire story go whoop, right? We see the entire story display all at once, right? Why is that happening?
We're not awaiting input.
We're not awaiting input, right? Because we don't have our choices loaded in, right? So we have successfully loaded our story, which is great, right? But we haven't loaded in our choices. So as a result, it's default choosing the first index in our choice. So if I actually go, I'm going to kind of leave this running. If I actually go and look at my story here, I'm going to kind of scroll up in my output, right? There once was a conference, continued, null. It was called GodotCon. I went to this awesome workshop, right? In the workshop, I saw Nicholas, and Nicholas said this. I said yes, right? Cool, see you later, right? So what's happening here is that it's always choosing the first choice in my narrative tree. And it's because, if we look at the code, right, if we scroll down, it's always selecting choice 0, right? And so for anybody that knows, like, you know, arrays and computer science, right? So choice 0 is always the first element in an array, right? So it's always choosing that first choice. But we want to wait for input, right? We want to wait for the player to choose the actual choice. So really quickly, I'm going to comment out the select choice because I don't want it to just automatically do that for us, right? I want us to actually connect these things together. So now that we have our story loaded, let's go ahead and refresh this. And so what I have now here is just the first line of my story with no choices, right? And so that's like the desired outcome. Obviously, we want to get our choices, right? But it's not automatically going towards the end of our story. Cool? So now let's integrate those choices into our project. So in the continue story function, where it has this if ink player has choices, we want to now start to display those choices. So what we're going to do is that we're going to say for a choice in ink player, we already have this nice for loop here, right? We want to add child. And we need to first load and instantiate this, right? So we're going to create a temporary variable, and I'm going to call this btn, just short for button, right? And it's going to be that choice button that's instantiated. Oh, instantiate. Not I said instantiated, but we just want instantiate, right? And we're going to add that btn, right, to our choice. Excuse me, to our choices here. But we're adding it, where do we want to add this to?
VBox.
The VBox, absolutely. So if I just add it here, it'll add it to the topmost node. So we want to say VBox container.add child button. Okay? And now, how would we get that button to trigger our selection? Go ahead.
You just change that, we can connect the signal in the choice button scene to I guess probably the same function commented out.
So what we're going to do is that we're going to say button, right? Connect dot pressed, right? Because that's the, right? We want to get this pressed signal, right? And we're going to have that go to select choice, but we want to pass a particular, right? That function takes an argument, right, of an index, right? So how are we going to pass the argument that we want in here?
Bind.
Bind? Absolutely. Who said that? Oh, cool. In the back. Sorry. Great. So we want to say dot bind, right? And what do we want to say here?
Button index. Get index of the button.
Yeah, so we want to say choice, right, which is the thing in our loop here, choice dot index, right? Because that's the loop that we're iterating through in this array of current choices. Cool? So because we have, when we are returning the choices from this, inquiry, this if the ink player has choices, right, then it should return the current choices that are available to us as an array, right? So we're going to iterate through that array using a for loop, and then we're going to say whatever the index of that choice is in the available choices that we have available to us, then choose that index to continue on. Okay? Let's try. Let's see. So I'll save this again. And it's broken. Oh, I'm in the wrong scene. Just kidding, it's not broken. Let's see. Okay. So I need, so because it's not callable, how do I do this again? Oh yeah, is that what I did? Oh yeah. Sorry. Pressed, that connect, my bad. I just did what you told me to do. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah. So what's the issue that we're having here, right? So we have our button loaded here, right? But let's go to the remote. So our button is there, but what else do we need? Not quite.
Put a text in the button.
Absolutely, right? So we need to take the text of that button and display it in our button. Sorry, that was totally circular logic, right? We need to take the text of our choice and put it into the text of our button. Okay, so we're going to say button dot text equals choice dot text. Okay? Now we can continue. Oh, but we have an issue. Oh no. Oh, heck yes! So what's happening here?
Not clearing your buttons out.
Absolutely, right? So we're adding our buttons to our VBox, right? But we're not removing them, we're not erasing them when we select them, right? So I want to be able to do that in my choice here, right? I want to be saying like, okay, when you choose the choice of whatever button that you have pushed, right? Go through all of the children in our VBox array and get rid of them, okay? So we'll say before continue story, we're gonna say for, we can say for choice, we were using kind of that syntax before, in VBox container dot get children choice dot queue free. Cool. So again, just a very simple for loop that's saying that after we've chosen this choice, for every child that's in our VBox container, get rid of it. Cool, because we're going to load in more choices after that. Cool? So let's hit play. Much better. Oh. And now we meet Rob. Now we say, heck yes. Cool? So this is, again, the very, very starting point of being able to iterate through our story using Ink and Godot, right? Now, we want to get a little bit more interesting and sophisticated and, just like cool, right, doing this. Because that's the whole point of doing game design, is to be cool, I guess. Okay, but what we want to be able to do is that we want to be able to at least, from the start, to be able to get some information, right, some data from that story that we just created. So let's go back to our story. I'm going to go back to our ink. And if you notice that I had this other variable here that was this had lunch variable. Cool? I want to be able to get this had lunch variable and do something with it at some point in my story, right? If I've had lunch, dynamically change something in the story or display something on screen, right, like we had before, right? Why don't we do that, actually, since it was a question that we had before, right? So we can say if you're hungry or not, depending on if you've gone to lunch. Cool? Cool. It's getting close to be dinner time, so hopefully this isn't making people's tummy grumble. Okay, so I have here in my variables, right, or in my story, that if I do choose that choice, right, then I've set that variable to true, right? If I haven't, then it's going to remain in its default state of always being false, right? So let's go back over to Unity, or Unity, ugh. Fuck. Okay, bye everybody. Okay, so cut that part out. Okay, Jesus Christ, sorry. Okay, I'm so embarrassed. That was awful. That was so awful. Okay, what we're gonna do, Jesus. All right, so what we're gonna do is that we're gonna use this other built-in method here that's called observe variables, okay? And so this is another built-in variable here, built-in function that we have here that is gonna be able to look at any variables that have been changed in our ink story and then respond, right, or call a function if a change has happened to those variables, right? Now, something that's tricky about this, and something that I want to just be kind of a word of caution when we're using this type of technique, is that if you're about to use this method, and you're looking for a variable in this kind of array that we'll have here, we'll uncomment this in a second. But if you're looking for a variable here that doesn't exist in your story, you're gonna get a fatal error, unfortunately. So it's important that not only that you design a system that has a lot of flexibility, right, but that also you're putting in some basically null point exceptions to say okay, if this variable doesn't exist in the story, then don't worry about checking it. Does people follow what I'm talking about, right? Because yeah, if you're checking for a variable that doesn't exist in your story, the ink player is just gonna fall apart, right? It doesn't know what to do with it. So we're going to, at the very top here, create a new variable. And I'm gonna call this something like story var, maybe story vars, just to give it a nice plural. And I'm going to create an array, and I'm going to be looking for some strings, because those are going to be the variables that are passed through JSON. So the string that I'm looking for here is had lunch. And again, this is going to be different depending on what variable you might be looking for. But please make sure that whatever variable that you're looking for in your ink story is, right, paying attention to cases, right? It's case sensitive, spelling, all that kind of good stuff, right? Because again, if it doesn't have it, if it isn't able to find that, right, it will cause some situations and some errors. So I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to, in my story loaded, I'm going to uncomment my observe variables function, because I want to be able to observe those variables, right? And I also then, of course, need to uncomment the function that's in my that's in the template file. Why is that returning something strange?
Oh, indentation issues.
But
To me, it's adding a single space. If there's just like one space in front of observe or behind observed variables.
oh, that's so weird. Oh, I see why. Yes, sorry. Thank you, everybody. Okay, cool. All right, so we have observed variables here. I need to do the same thing here, I think. Yeah. There we go. Okay, and so in the default template that we have here, right, we're looking for this array of variables that we're looking for. Obviously, we want to replace that var1, var2 array with the variable that we just made at the top, right? So I want to replace this first argument in this function, and I'm going to replace that with story vars. And while I'm here, I'm also going to uncomment, oops, this new function. I'm getting the same error over and over, huh?
Line 110 has an extra space.
Oh my goodness, y'all. Okay, thank you all so much. So I'm uncommenting that because I also want to be pulling from this. And this is where the observed variables is being bound to, or basically calling, almost like a signal, an internal signal, right, to this other separate function. So what I want to do here is that I'll maybe just make a new, or like hungry text dot visible, and we'll make that node in 1 second equal true, right? Oh, and we need to say here, if new value equals true, then we'll say that that's true. And again, I'm kind of doing this for the sake of, I'm kind of speeding up here because I know that we're like very close to time. But you want to be making sure that you're putting in some null point exceptions here, so that what I would do here is that I would say if, and I would create an if statement that would say if the story contains these variables, then continue on. If not, just return, right? So that you're not kind of creating some potential errors along the way. Again, I would put that here. So I would say like if, yeah, sorry, just for time, I'm gonna kind of continue on, but I can show you an example. If you actually look in the visual novel template example, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. Again, just because I want to make sure that we have time for the very last thing, I'm kind of doing this a little bit quickly. So let's add this label here, and we're gonna name this hungry text, hungry, not hungry, hungry text. We're going to turn this off, visibility off, and I'll just put in here, you hungry. And then I'll make sure that this is displayed somewhere else unique on screen. Okay? So now I'm not going to click on awesome lunch, and then I can go through the rest of my thing, and I can see that it's not actually triggering that observe variables, and I think that's because I need to make sure that it contains the variable that we're looking for. So what I need to say is that if variable name, or what I need to say here actually, if story vars has variable name and I see, I'm kind of doing the opposite here. Because I'm looking for true and it's still set to false, right? So, so if it's, then this will be this, and then else hungry. This isn't the best example of this, but we can look at it as an example that's a little bit more accurate. Because again, we're kind of doing the opposite of what we're intending here. But yeah, go ahead.
You can just set the visible to the new value.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. Yeah, that's totally much more efficient. Absolutely, for sure. I mean, this is going to do the opposite of what we intend, but let's just kind of show for intents and purposes that it's reading the variable. It's going to say that you're hungry even if you went to lunch, which, sometimes is actually what happens. So I had an awesome lunch, and right, it's reading the variable and then displaying the text, right? So again, the logic is unsound here, right? But the intention here is just to show how we're using that built-in function to have Godot dynamically respond to what's happening in our story. Yes? I just created a new label and then went into the label and just hard-coded it. Yeah. I didn't get that from ink, for instance. Yeah. Yes?
I'm sorry, could you scroll back to where we initially wanted to grab story bars?
Yep. It's just right here. So inkplayer.observe variables, and then observe variables as a function is going to be taking basically 3 arguments here. It's going to be first checking for an array of potential variables that you want to look for. Then it's going to be asking what you want to be, what basically signal that you want to be sending this to, or what object you want to be sending this signal to. We're just sending it to itself, and then we're calling variable changed. So you can kind of think about this as like somewhat of a signal projection or signal sending, right? But we're just doing it internally.
So story bars originates right there?
Excuse me. Yes.
Oh, okay.
Totally. Let me just clarify. So we created a variable at the very top here. That's the array that we're looking for. And again,
It's just the same name as in your namespace.
absolutely, 100%. Filled in the blank there. Again, I'm so sorry that I'm going through that last little bit a little bit quickly.
Oh, no, it's
Just because we're pressed for time and I want to do like 2 more slides. But if there's other questions, please, I'm happy to take them right now. Yeah.
So you set, and I also did it in my program, like we set some default values for these things, right? How do we, is there a way of getting at those?
Yes, there are ways of then setting the variable based upon other game state. So again, I'm not going to have time to hard code that or to code that with you right now, but this is a great question to transition to looking at this example project file. If you look at the example project file here, this is a very, very simple, I'm just going to play this really quickly and then we can look at the code together. But this is a very, very simple kind of visual novel style, Otome, whatever kind of blah. That's just like, it's basically the same thing that we did right now. But if you notice the characters, faces change based upon reading expressions. And I had fun. I won't. Okay, see you later. Bye. Right? So this is still reading variables from the text, but from the ink script. But you can also have your observe variables send information to Godot that then you could overwrite. It's typically not good practice to try to overwrite variables to the ink text itself, since it's going to be JSON that you're basically writing the JSON and not the story file itself. But there are ways of doing that within InkGD. If you, again, not to overlook this fact, but if you go to the docs of InkGD, there is a function, there's a public method that you can use that then you can go to the ink file and inject your own variables to write certain things based upon game states. Again, from a narrative design perspective, you really want the story to be handling a lot of that variable management stuff, because you don't want to accidentally overwrite information if you're doing like a looping storytelling, right, where you're overwriting a variable, but then the story is overwriting it again when you revisit that node. So again, you want to do most of that management stuff within the story, I would say within the ink story itself. That's kind of, again, practice. Yes?
So kind of general question about the plugin in GD. So how does it handle localization, for instance?
That's a really good question. So that was actually one of the other aspects of using ink, actually, is that ink is particularly well suited for doing localization because it does output JSON files. So you can do a lot of quick-ish find and replace. So I would say that that would be on the output side of what ink delivers, rather than on this side of Godot. So what I would the way of answering that question is that I would have that be an interface situation where, depending on what language you have selected in a menu, right, that's loading different stories based upon different ink scripts, right, as the resource at that point, and that would map to whatever language that you've chosen.
So you'd be creating those scripts manually, right?
Well, you would modify the JSON scripts outside of the software. I don't think, I mean, unless you wanted to incorporate some kind of like live interpreting AI system that is way beyond the scope of what we're going to be able to cover today. Yeah, you would be loading in a separate script that we would have manually overwritten in some way. Do you have a follow up there, and then?
So I'm gonna ask about that. So you basically would generate different JSONs for different languages, and then just make some simple logic that, based on your chosen language, chooses the right JSON files to load.
It would replace the. Let me just show. It would replace this variable, right? Yeah, dynamically based upon what choices that you made. Absolutely, yes.
And so like your inky would probably be in English, and then produce JSON.
Or whatever native language of your developers, yes.
And then you want to manipulate the inky product. You're saying, like, you don't think about multiple languages in the inky writing. It's on that JSON that you want to do something to that JSON in your native language, and then turn that into all the language, right?
So there are additional tools. So again, Inky is open source, and I know that there are localization tools that people have built to do much more in-engine work for localization. And by in-engine, I mean like in Inky work for doing that kind of translation work on the fly and localization work on the fly. Again, it's a little bit beyond the purview of what we can cover, but I know that there's a very active community of people that are thinking about using the software explicitly for those ends. Yes?
Do you think about dialoguing around those software plugins?
Is Emmy in here? Because no, I'm just kidding. Dialogic's great. Like I don't want to ever take away from any other tools, right? This is one method that I think has wide application, and the design philosophies and the programming philosophies behind how Inky is built, I think nest really well or gel really well with narrative design practices as a whole. That's not to say that it's superior or inferior or better or worse than any other tool that's out there. I think Dialogic is great because what it does is that it really thinks about really small snippets, whereas I think Ink can become quite large quite quickly. Right, so I think it's really dependent on preference and tool building and different things that you want to integrate. But for my for my opinion, right, what's really nice about using Inky is its portability, is its ability to do separate out of Godot engine localization that is just outputting a very operable file in a way that can be kind of transcoded into other systems quite easily, right? The other thing that I would say too is that you can publish Ink stories separate outside of Godot to the web quite natively, right? It's like Twine in that way, where you can export HTML files that you can do some really rapid prototyping of dialogue or narrative or prose or item description or whatever you have quite quickly without needing to even get into the engine necessarily.
Your experience is also like translatable to any sort of ordinary language.
There are some particularities. Rob and I were talking about this a little bit, the differences between Ink and Twine, for instance. Yeah, so Yarn Spinner is like, it's kind of Twine adjacent, I would say, in that it's similar kind of, not quite node-based structure, but it is have a system where it's, I think, a little bit more kind of graphically minded, or it has the opportunity at least for being more graphically minded.
What you call knots in Ink is called a node.
Right. Yeah. So it's very similar, right? We're really thinking about these like little storylets. I think that that's a common phrase that's used within narrative design. Storylets, which are like little snippets of writing right? That then kind of compound into a larger story arc or are integrated into the story in different ways. Another way of answering that question too, perhaps, or maybe other questions that people have that's about like use cases of this. I would not necessarily use ink to do things like item descriptions, right? Like that might not be the best use case for this. What ink is really good at is doing branching narrative, doing systems-based design for thinking about larger narrative systems. But if it's like, if you're just wanting to create, you know, a table of resources that are items that, you know, custom items that have particular things with them, I would create a separate tool to do that. And I would do that in Godot rather than thinking about how to integrate ink into doing that. Cool. Some of the last things that I just want to say, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly. As a kind of wrap up, there's a lot of resources out there for thinking through different narrative design ideas. Here's a couple things just to kind of like reference. On the ink side, there's the Inkle Studios Discord. Again, a very, very popular resource. It's a very active and I think quite generous and friendly community. I'm on there frequently, so if you have questions and follow-up things, by all means go over there. The Ink GD docs are also really great, really handy. A narrative designer and interactive storytelling professor, Dan Cox, is very interested in this kind of stuff. He has a whole treasure trove of various different narrative design tools and how to integrate them into various different game engines. It's a fantastic resource. Some of his stuff is slightly dated, but still I think very, very useful. Another user, Golden XP, has a list of tutorials of how to integrate ink into Godot. Want to give him or them a shout out as well. The tutorials that I reference from SA Game Studio, the studio that I run, that's also there. And then for narrative design stuff, we have Emily Short's blog, a very foundational, a very, I think, central figure within interactive storytelling and branching narrative kind of thinking and design theory. The GDC Vault, for people that haven't looked at the GDC Vault, there's a ton of narrative design stuff in there. Hannah Nicklin's talk that I referenced before about multiple middles is in the GDC Vault. That's free and available. You don't have to have the membership to access that talk. I would highly recommend that. Rose Behar, who's a narrative designer at Scopely, has a very, very good newsletter. I think it's monthly. That's called the Narrative News Letter. I think it's just called the Narrative News. It's very, very good. The Polaris Game Design Retreat, they have a lot of amazing resources about creative ways of thinking about story and expression. They just released their most recent papers and publishing about that. And there's a lot of very notable indie voices that go to that retreat and give their opinions about that. And then the last resource that I would just say up here is the Narrative Department, which is a course that specializes in teaching people how to do narrative design and how to become game writers using industry-based practices. It's a course that I took that I highly recommend. Susan O'Connor runs it. It has a price tag on it, but the resources in the community, for me at least, were really valuable in kind of thinking through a lot of the stuff that I have here. All of these resources and direct links to them are in, not there. They are here in this paste bin. If you go here, all the links are right there. So you can go there. I know I saw people taking pictures, but you can also use a computer. And that's it. Okay. Thank you so much. That's links to my socials and different ways of contacting me. It has other things there too. If you want to follow me on Blue Sky or LinkedIn or whatever, you can scan that and my stuff is there. Cool. If there's anybody that has any further questions or wants to talk through use cases or narrative design ideas or concepts or anything like that, I'll be hanging out for a little bit afterwards as I'm kind of packing up. But also feel free to reach out to me digitally. I love hearing from folks and talking about this stuff, so seriously, don't hesitate. Okay, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you to GodotCon for having me. It's been a real joy being here. Thank you so much. Bye.